Hello and welcome to another long overdue episode of Transcontinental Overload. I'm Stephanie, your host, back in New Jersey, back to the grind after a long summer, traveling to Europe and not doing anything about podcasting. I have a real treat for you today if you are, like myself, a bit of an education enthusiast, education warrior. Passionate about education, about how we can improve the education system and how we can help our kids prepare for the challenges of our world, which is so drastically different to what we and our parents grew up in. My guest is someone who is actively involved in the field of education. I am talking to Brantley Turner, the East Asia Education Director for Dwight Schools. Dwight Schools are a global network of private international baccalaureate schools with a focus on visionary leadership and individuality. And I think they have a total of 6 campuses worldwide. I've put a link in the show notes if you are interested and you want to learn more about those schools. Brantley was born and grew up in Brooklyn, New York, but spent about 25 years of her life in China, including a decade as the founding principal of a unique Sino-US high school that was approved by the Chinese Ministry of Education, which is a pretty phenomenal feat. Brantley moved back to the US with her family during the COVID pandemic and right now is starting a new venture in Hanoi, Vietnam. She's a fervent believer in the power of disruption in education, which is something that I read that about her and it really appealed to me. And she has some really interesting views and we talk about her experience as an educator and of course also about her personal experience raising a family in China. I loved our conversation so much, especially since I feel like I've spent so much time discussing the difficulties and complications of expat life with my guests on this podcast, and especially those with children. And this conversation put such a positive spin on it all and really emphasized how living in another country can actually really, really be a benefit, especially for young people. Anyway, you can see for yourself, or rather listen for yourself. Here is Brantley's story. Hi Brantley, I'm so excited to have you. Welcome to Transcontinental Overload. So happy you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie.
I'm so excited because education is one of my favorite subjects and I have written about it and I talk about it. People who know me know that, about the troubles in the education systems all over the world, actually, not just in the US. That's the one I'm most familiar with, but of course also Germany. And I love to complain about it and say how much it needs to change and adapt to today's world. And but I'm not actually doing anything. I'm just complaining. So I'm really excited to talk to someone who is actually doing something and is a disruptor of the education system. So thank you so much for making the time.
I'm looking forward to talking about it. I wouldn't discredit yourself too much. I mean, definitely the world of podcasting is also making an effort to educate because it's sharing messages and trying to contribute. I mean, it takes a huge effort to do what you do as well. I think, it'll be fun to talk about education. And it's one of those things where it's so present for everybody in their lives in some way, shape, or form, but can feel overwhelming to know how to deal with the various challenges facing education today. And so I'm happy to be here to kind of offer a perspective which dovetails with your show and this idea of how can sort of being somebody who's interested in global issues and transcontinental challenges and opportunities and how that kind of can dovetail with the education industry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, can't wait to talk about all that. But let's go back to the beginnings. Who's Brantley Turner?
So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I'm American, quite obviously, but my parents are from the South originally, so quite small towns in Alabama and Tennessee. So the initial kind of migration story of our family was my parents leaving the South and moving to New York, where I was then born. But I spent a lot of time in the South as a child and today as well, and did not have a lot of exposure to going abroad or going overseas. And that wasn't an opportunity that the majority of my family had at all. So when I was 17, due to my parents' work, started to have more opportunities to exit the US, and they moved to Hong Kong. I was going to university, so I didn't go with them, but certainly them moving, such a huge move from New York, gave me a lot of opportunities to start traveling to Asia. And I like to say to people, when I was 17, we were sort of just getting like email and internet, and that was the focus, right? I was not sort of thinking about how China was playing a role in the world and what was starting to happen there.
Mm-hmm.
Stumbled into this unbelievable story of China over the last 30 years. So from where I've lived in, really outside of the US, I've spent the most of my time in China, around Asia. I am in the process of moving to Hanoi, Vietnam for an education project, which we can talk about today. But really, I would say my exposure has been primarily to China. My parents left Hong Kong and moved to Paris. And sadly, I have not spent as much time there as would have been nice to. But so I guess from a family perspective, our small little family unit has continued to pursue opportunities to be in different places.
Mm-hmm.
But home base is still the US, and this is where we ultimately all get together.
Mm-hmm. And this is where you are right now too,
yes.
right? On a kind of in between China and Vietnam
Correct.
hiatus. Okay. And so what you said you were at college when your parents moved. What did you do at college? Was there anything to do with Asia?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in some ways it radically transformed the direction of my life. And this is something that I talk to my students about all the time, because I've spent so much of my time as a high school educator. And it's this glorious time of like 15 to 18 where so much is happening and they're on their way. And I've talked a lot about my own story, applying out of high school. I thought I would study English and environmental science. I had the opportunity to go to China the summer between high school and undergrad. And so I went to China and I thought, wow, this language is interesting. This place is interesting. There's so much going on. So I pivoted and I started taking Mandarin freshman year of college. I then continued it for 4 years throughout. My major was East Asian studies, specializing in sort of China and North Asia. But then I also studied art. So I studied something called art semiotics, which is kind of like the linguistics of visual texts, how we see things. And wound up, I've had jobs that have intersected with both of those areas. So it actually worked out for me in terms of what I studied being fairly
amazing,
practically applicable, but it certainly wasn't planned that way.
Yeah, but that sounds fascinating. And I can imagine that, because I mean, coming from a Western perspective, just thinking about the Chinese language, which is so visual. It's such it's just the signs and everything. It's just from a complete, like I have a single word of Chinese. So for me, it's just beautifully looking language, but it's completely alien to me. So it's almost like it's on a picture, like an work of art. So it totally makes sense to.
There's sort of an interesting story. So this is not my story, but it's kind of a commonly known topic to talk about Steve Jobs going to Reed College and then dropping out. But one of the things that people emphasize when they want to talk about his creativity is people often say, oh, Steve Jobs studied Chinese calligraphy and art at Reed. And look, I don't think the two necessarily explain each other at all, but it is a sort of way of thinking about language and a very different approach to language, and certainly the visual aspect of Chinese calligraphy. I mean, my calligraphy could not be worse. I have horrible handwriting in both English and Chinese, so I'm certainly not an artist, but I do think that looking at codes, and the cool thing about Chinese, just really briefly, is, not all characters are pictures, right? Traditionally they were pictures, but the script is so evolved that there's so many different roots of how Chinese language has evolved. And it's very cool, like if you're in the language, to dig in and to understand that whole history and origin. But last thing I would say is learning Chinese is not as hard as people think. I took German for 3 weeks in high school. That was enough for me. I found learning Chinese way easier because the grammar is more similar to English than people might think.
Oh, wow. Really? Yeah, I had no idea. And I also wouldn't want to learn German. So I'm very happy that I never had to. But isn't it interesting? I always love talking to people who learn different languages because everyone has a different preference, I want to say. And then some languages just come more easily than others. But I mean, clearly, if you say you've spent the best part of the last 30 years involved in and around China,
Mhm.
so I imagine it's second nature.
It is. And, it certainly wasn't. This is another thing that I've always tried to emphasize so with my students from the language perspective and from the college perspective, it's like, hey, you know what? Just because you're really great at chemistry now doesn't mean you have to be a chemist. But showing that you can dedicate yourself and that you can push through will help you when you face things like, oh my gosh, I'm 18 and I'm going to start learning a new language. And, you will be able to draw on those resources of challenges that you've taken on throughout your education. And I think that's really important. And I think at the same time, the kind of the challenge and the conflict of starting to really live in a new culture is something that, so at the school that I ran and I started and I ran in China high school, 100% of our students would come abroad for university, maybe about 75% to the US, other places, Canada, UK, primarily studying in English. They, for the most part, had not spent time outside of China. And in many cases, their parents have never traveled outside of China and don't speak English. And these kids are doing the international baccalaureate in English. Amazing. But that intercultural conflict piece, I had a student say to me once, I had a student who went to Emory in the South in Atlanta, and he came back after the first year, came to visit and was like, Miss Turner, I know you said like to make these relationships with people from different places. He said, it's just so inefficient. And I said, well, the last 18 years of my life in China, trying to learn how to do banquets and go to meetings that are being conducted in a way that's completely unusual from my perspective. Yeah, I guess it isn't that efficient. But what is the other value that we can find from the experience? And that's true. It's a process and it takes time and it's a full process, right? You know this so well.
That's what I love the most about learning a language, because it's such a portal into a whole other dimension, because it's not just about being able to communicate on a being able to express yourself and saying what you want to say, or just to kind of find your way around. But it's much more than that. It's just a way into the culture, a different way of thinking. And when you realize that, and then you realize that if you really want to learn this language, you have to live in the country at some point, or spend a lot of time in direct contact with native speakers and surrounded by it. I mean, in full immersion, it's the only way to really learn. But then it's an amazing experience. And so that's what I think when I first started learning languages. I loved the way it felt to say words that were different and would express something known, but it just sounded beautiful. Then realizing, oh wow, there's a whole population who speak just that language. Amazing. And then I think your head just goes into this whole, whoa, the world is so much bigger than I thought it was. And I love that the most.
I think, no question. I think what's so fascinating about the actual language experience. So like two thoughts. One is every time I get into a taxi in Hanoi, I've been 6 times in the last year, I turn on my Google Voice thing and have it tell the person what I need to tell them. And it's because I haven't learned how to pronounce the language yet. I have work to do. I will, focus on that more when I'm there physically. And I just feel embarrassed if all I do is rely on my phone. But it's both very empowering. It's super cool to they play their phone and I play my phone and we're going on this journey and we're recognizing that we can't communicate, but there's enough of a respect to want to try to be there and go somewhere. But, of course, some of the gift of the old days of learning was the language lab with the old tapes and, none of that, just like it's at your phone, taking away your own, need to commit. But the other thing about it too is your own physical transformation through the use of different languages. I am a different person in Chinese. So Chinese, I speak French poorly. I mean, I made it through AP French in high school, and I've had some opportunity to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese, I can speak and read and write well. And it's a transformative process for me, and I can feel it physically. I was in Shanghai a couple of weeks ago with a New York colleague. So I still work for the same school group, just so people get it. Like, I was in China, started a school for this New York school. This year, I'm back at the New York school, which is 151 years old, called Dwight Schools. I'm the East Asia Education Director. We have schools in Seoul, Shanghai, and now Hanoi. So I'm working on opening Hanoi, just so people get like the thread of
the full picture,
how it all comes together. Yeah. And so I was with a colleague who's a college guidance counselor in Shanghai and who's known me in New York this year, sort of cursorily. And she said to me, she's like, "Oh my gosh, it's so cool to see you in your element." I was like, well, I'm like from New York. So, but the thing is just that the energy transformation and how excited I was to be back in the environment of speaking Chinese. And also, I'll be honest, this year in New York, the fact that I haven't had to function in 2 languages all the time has been incredibly liberating to do like deep work and actually be in meetings and think because I can so naturally just hear and I haven't had to do any translation. So, I would advocate both experiences are really interesting, but it's being aware of them, what it's like if you're speaking your mother tongue, home country language versus if you are, and really embracing that, like taking the time to be so comfortable in your own language, but also pushing yourself to get out of that comfort by trying on a new language.
I've always thought, I when I was a child, I really, and especially when I started learning languages, I always kind of felt like I would love to be an actress. I would love to be an actress. And, but I was way too shy to even say that out loud. But to me, it was almost like speaking another language would make me feel like I was acting. And then the transition from doing that and feeling like, oh, this is not me, I'm acting, to then actually live there. And then you become that because you're no longer acting. I mean, I'm not acting when I speak English now. And yet I feel, like you said earlier, I'm a slightly different person when I speak English to when I speak German. And it's just such an interesting process. I can't. This is another one of my favorite subjects. And there've been lots of studies and articles written and published in the last 5 to 10 years, I think, about that, the multiple personality aspect. So you can be more assertive in one language or more polite in the other, or just feel less pushy, or there's more humor in one, and it's just I love it. I definitely feel, while I'm always being myself, the different aspects of myself are coming out differently.
Absolutely. And it so taps into the sort of sense of observation, and you think about it and like mimicry and sort of copying, and you can think about those things in negative ways, or you can think about them in the way in which they develop your ability to be that way. So I was in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago, and Taiwanese Mandarin is known to be quite polite and quite formal and very soft and calm. And immediately, I was at duty free in the Taipei airport, and I'm like, oh, thank you so much. Now, honestly, I'm probably not that polite in general, but you get into this mode, right? And because you're seeing all around you. And I really love that. I love kind of noticing that. And I think it's so important to harness those powers of observation and sort of observe and say, what are you seeing and what are you feeling? And again, I think it's one of the things that is challenging for students, for younger people who spend so much time only kind of activating their digital or their audio and their visual sense, but not taking in the other senses that combine when you're kind of in a situational environment in a different country, and how important people watching is, and just observe, even if you don't know what's going on.
And this really resonates with me so much, because it's like I live just outside of New York now, and when I go to the UK to see friends and family, the English I use is very different. So it's kind of the same thing. It's British English has there's way more, I don't know, flowery stuff around the language. So it's also much more polite. Not that English people are more polite, but the languages for sure. And so it's funny to kind of slip into that and then observe yourself and think, yeah. And that's what I mean by you have to, in order to really absorb a language, you have to be immersed in it, in the surroundings, and observing, and that way you pick up on so much. And yeah, I love it. I was going to ask you something. What was I going to say? I tried to make a little mental note and whoops, it's gone. Anyway, it'll come to me. So yeah, why don't you talk us through a little bit of your professional, so you said it's the Dwight schools. How long have you been doing that, and how did that start?
I began my career in China after graduate school. I went to grad school in China in Chinese at this program Johns Hopkins has. And a lot of the folks that do that program go kind of more like State Department track. And I jumped into Shanghai, moved to Shanghai, and worked in advertising. And that was that kind of art background coming into play. And part of the reason that I did that at the time was there weren't the opportunities in education in China, which were as interesting to me. I taught English. I have also taught Chinese. I taught Chinese in the US and English in China, and I'm a terrible language teacher. So it's so fun that actually we just talked a lot about language, because actually that is not my forte. I have a TEFL, teaching English as a foreign language certificate. So I got through that, but language is not my gift in terms of teaching. And so I didn't find an opportunity that was particularly interesting in teaching. So I jumped in. I worked in the corporate sector, and I worked for 5 years in advertising and then market research. And my specialty in market research was youth. I was a qualitative market researcher, so focus groups, and traveled all over China doing projects for companies from Coca-Cola to L'Oreal, Diageo, Siemens, so really European and American large multinational corporations, and research in China as a lot of them developed their China strategy. So this is in late 1990s, early 2000s. And it was great, but there was a sort of pull to me that I still didn't want to not have a job related to education. And I was in a in-depth immersive interview with a trendsetter in Beijing for Nike apparel that was launching in China. And I walked out of the interview. I'd spent like 10 hours with this kid. I walked out of it and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I want to be having these same conversations, but I want this to be focused on something different. So I started an education business to bring groups of students from primarily the US and Europe to China, and ran experiential education, all sorts of activities, team building, summer programs, et cetera, for many years. And that's how I got hooked up with the Dwight schools. So I got hooked up with the Dwight schools in 2008 because Dwight was starting a pilot program in Beijing. I was living in Shanghai. We started a pilot program in Beijing, which was the first US high school, Chinese high school direct partnership with no like agent or intermediary setting it up.
It was all fairly new then.
Super new. And basically what it was, and I'm sure listeners can understand, the Chinese education landscape's highly, highly regulated. So you can't just access international curriculum if you're a Chinese national. So these were pilot programs to introduce international curriculum teaching in English to Chinese nationals, with the goal that the majority of those kids would then not participate in the Chinese higher exam, the Gaokao, which gets you into college. So we ran a pilot program. I worked on that for 6 years, and about 4 years into that, had an opportunity in Shanghai to meet Qibao High School, which would be a top performing test in public high school in Shanghai. And Qibao had been tapped by the Shanghai Education Commission, which is the Ministry of Education in Shanghai, to start an independent school
Mhm.
Sino-US cooperative. So we had this sort of groundwork laid because we had a lot of experience in Beijing. And
Yeah.
then we had this opportunity. And honestly, it was 2013 when we really got approved. So I started working on that in 2012. And it's the only one of its kind in the country. Things shifted slightly post our formation, mainly because the government funded the whole real
Mhm.
estate project, the build. It's really expensive to start schools because of the property requirements to do so. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of stories, and the rest is sort of history. School's doing well. So I served as the American principal of that school for its first 9 years of operation, but I worked on the project for a total of 10.
So, but I mean, I'm just, when you mentioned the Chinese curriculum is highly regulated, and as I mean, I guess as Westerners, we always have this idea of China being like everything is ruled by the government and everything is going a certain way, and there's not much deviation. So, to get the to get someone to actually be open to the idea of a US Sino-US connection in terms of education, and then have kids there who will then not finish school in the Chinese system. I mean, that's huge. How was that? It's just, or were they just so forward looking? Did they see the importance of the cultural connection and exchange, especially exchange?
I would say, so what China does really well is educate the majority of its people. And they do that through a system which sort of
Mhm.
resembles what you think of when you think of Chinese education. What I mean by they educate them well is literacy rates in China are off the charts, right?
Yeah,
Girls and boys are
it's
educated
it's
with
the
equal
cliche.
opportunity,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And education is a value as it is across Asia. So the reality, however, though, is when we were getting started, annually, you would have about 9 million students aged for that exam that year. So the Gaokao that year. So let's say you had about 9 million students who would be eligible to take this exam,
Mhm.
but only about 7 million spots in university.
Okay.
And those universities would be across a broad range. So if you're to look at something like ranking, and we could have a whole other show about whether ranking is good or not, but the point is that if you look at rank, a lot of those Chinese universities, particularly back then, this is more than 10 years ago now, would not have fallen into top global 50 schools, top global 100 schools, et cetera. So as parents started to see the direction of heavy interconnectivity, interdependence globally, sort of say, okay, maybe doing the Chinese national exam isn't the best pathway to set my child up for a more interconnected world. That's one. Number two, when I got into college, it was something like 30,000 applications. I don't know, 20,000 applications. If you were to say that to someone in China, they would laugh. They're like, oh, all you have to do is be one out of 20,000. I mean, that's so easy, and so again, just such a fierce competition for those very few spots at the best schools. So a lot of parents would say, well, hey, it's bone breaking for my child to try to get a spot at one of the top Chinese universities, Beida, Tsinghua, but they could get into a really great university overseas and have higher chances to do so. So that was the other thing. Now, the misconception early on was it'll be easier to do international curriculum. And I used to always say to parents and students at admissions events, like, listen, don't pick this pathway because you think it's easier. Because the reality is you're going to be studying international curriculum in English, which you have very little preparation for. You'll be doing inquiry work. You will be doing hands-on work, collaborative work. It will not just be you and a pencil and a test.
Yeah.
And so it didn't fit every student, but for those students that it fit, it was incredibly liberating opportunity. And look, I mean, this also costs money. So certainly you have a range of Chinese national students who come abroad for school, but the early 90s, you had physics PhDs and stuff at every top US university who were not paying that tuition. When you shifted to the undergraduate level, and in some cases even the high school level, you have families paying that tuition. And the US universities loved it, kept many of them open.
Wow. Wow, that's an amazing trajectory, I think, to get involved in right at the beginning. And so you must have seen a real don't want to say a change, but from then, say the early 2000s to now, it must have the whole thing must have completely changed in terms of perception, the rates.
I think the change is certainly epic from the standpoint of that group of students. Right now, there's enough years where you have a group of students, of alumni who've had this experience. And I think, just very interestingly, how much this mirrors the experience of increased interdependence and what has sort of happened in the world from the supply chain standpoint. And what's crazy is anyone listening has a point of view about the supply chain, but the way in which it is intimately tethered to the experience of young people.
Mm-hmm.
And the people to people aspect of education and what it does, it's something absolutely to take a pause and recognize and think about. And I would say that because those migration stories, right? You have your story, I have my family story, and the way that funnels into the most important thing happening for young people outside of their family, which is essentially their education. And arguably the most important thing happening for the world, which is if we don't have a good grasp and understanding of our interdependence, we do not set ourselves up for a successful future.
Yeah, which really nicely brings us to our main kind of let's get into that the whole subject of education and the young population, especially now. It's such a topical thing to be talking about because of right now, just looking at what the Supreme Court's decision has been with, and we're not that we want to get into politics here, this is just in this frame, but I think we both agree the education is one of the most important things, and it seems to be taken away from people more and more. And this is where this is such a bad trend, because, and as I said earlier, one of my favorite subjects is this: how can we make education system better? How can we prepare the younger people for this world? Because the education system, the curriculum, not just here in the US and in all these other countries, has not changed much, whereas the world has changed drastically over the last, I want to say 20 years, 10 years, and it's no longer really serving anyone. And so that's obviously where you come in. And I think this is something that we as people who have seen different educational systems, been immersed in different cultures, we see things or pick up on things in a different way, rather than just staying in your own culture, following along with the school system, just kind of following this path that everyone seems to just fall into, because we have disrupted that for ourselves in our own life story. It's much easier to pick up on the weaknesses, I feel.
So I'm always happy to talk politics. I do teach global politics, my subject, right? So I teach International Baccalaureate Global Politics, awesome class. I taught in the fall. I'm not teaching right now because I'm about to move. But anyway, that aside, yes, just to anchor us in time on the podcast, right? The Supreme Court handed down the decision, which essentially in a nutshell is being billed as the end of affirmative action for university admissions. What I would just say about that to listeners now is watch this space from the standpoint of how are universities going to thread the needle on their populations, in the diversity of their populations, also serving their communities. These are public universities that are most subject to these changes.
Yeah.
But I would also say watch for the other things that will come out as a result of this decision, and legacy admissions, particularly for many private institutions. This is just as a space to watch. And I'm just excited that it's in the national dialogue. I think that we need to be talking about higher education for one very, very, very important reason. The US university system is one of, if not the best American export. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that's worth just emphasizing, and you definitely know this because the German system which is an amazing system and serves Germany incredibly well, it is very hard to get into a top engineering university in Germany.
Yep.
Chances are, you've been flagged earlier on whether you were going to go vocational track. Amazing, by the way. I wish more countries had that sort of path.
Yep. Whole other subject too.
Yes. But at the same time, right? It's the flexibility and the access of the US university system is unbelievable. And it is not something that most countries could even dream of putting in place as a system. And so I think it's soft power. It's a way to emphasize positive aspects of open liberal democracy. And we need it. And so I think any lens that's on the US higher education system brings value to us for understanding how impactful and how important that system is.
Yes. And the more it's talked about, the more people get galvanized by it too and jump into action and actually will put themselves out there and strive for change and for innovation. And I feel like this is, the German system, while we're talking about it, it's been so stagnant for a long time. And then it has changed over the last 10 years or so. Not that I know too much because I've been out of it for such a long time. But they certainly are realizing now how restrictive it is. And in terms of like desperately looking for people from other countries in terms of in all sorts of sectors, realizing the importance of opening up and being more flexible. And now it's again, that is all showcasing how rigid the system is. And it's all this is, like you said, watch this space. I think it's over there just as much as in this country. I think change is on the horizon. There is the definite like necessity for it is now being brought into the spotlight.
I think to your earlier point about how living outside one's own culture gives a lens to look at situations on the ground within your own culture or within the country in which you live. And I do think that if I, from my vantage point, look at US higher ed, my biggest concern is the lack of balance and the lack of competing voices and comfort sitting with paradox. What I most value, and again, having spent so many years, decades in a one-party state, I'm not an advocate for a one-party state. I'm not an advocate for an authoritarian regime. And I thereby so much more value the sense that we can have conversations in the United States that may be uncomfortable, that may require us to hold kind of conflicting ideas and turn them over and look at them. And to me, that should be happening in our higher education system. And I don't know that it is in the way that I think is best for young people. And I think there's another sort of aspect of being 18. We know from brain science, right, that your prefrontal cortex has not developed full ability to make great decisions at 18. It's why kids drive too fast and drink too much and party and make decisions and say, gosh, I don't know why I went along with that, right? Because your brain is not necessarily helping you make the best decisions. So if you get into an environment in which you are required or thought to be recruited to ideas that may not be in your best interest as a young person, it's scary to me that we aren't doing a better job of sort of guiding young people to hold on longer to the idea that there's many points of view, many perspectives, many ways of looking at the world. And this is the thing that I fear we're losing most. The polarization on both sides, the extreme at both sides, is very disconcerting to me because it's not the reality in which I've lived. People could be super bothered by the fact that I've spent so long in China. I recognize that. But I would so much rather have a conversation about why that bothers someone, what their perceptions are, not so that I have to change those perceptions. But so that I can contribute to what does that mean? And the final thing I would say on that is, I mean, gosh, don't we want people over there in China from the US, like building people to people relationships? Doesn't the world require that those relationships be made? And again, even, hey, you could say, hey, not for me, but no problem. I mean, I'm willing to spend that time. And the Vietnamese piece is not about imposing Western values on Vietnam, but it's about being engaged with a place that is now developing, that's trying to write its own narrative and needs access to the outside world for development.
But also it's an exchange. So it's not, like you said, you're not trying to impose something on someone. It is an exchange. So we're all learning from each other. And this is something that we've certainly, in our experience of going somewhere else and living somewhere else. And so you realize it's like you bring something, you gain something, it becomes this more global mindset. And that's where I feel schools fail so badly. And it's especially those high school years where the focus now, it just seems to be just on the academics and get the grades. And if you are in the US school system, I think more so than in the European schools, but here, as soon as you're a freshman in high school, you're 14 years old, all you hear is you need to get these grades, you need to, do this subject, and it's all about grades and which college to go to, rather than actually focusing on the person and critical thinking and the looking to hear the other point of view, and from a different culture, fostering exchanges and things like that. It all seems to be so, there's just not enough emphasis on any of it.
And certainly from my perspective of watching and guiding high school students for all these years, and I've had Chinese students and non-Chinese students, I haven't only had Chinese students, is just the mental health toll that it takes on them. So we cannot argue that the system works, even if we were to argue the system works for students that navigate it well. At the same time, the kind of the view of what the mental toll is, that you can only take on so much information. You can only be so good, like you said, at taking tests, etc. And I know we worry a lot about competitiveness, right? The US tends to score quite poorly on global benchmark exams for mathematics, for critical thinking, even for reading. And the thing about that is that's disturbing, but I would start by saying, well, let's look at the test. The other thing that I would say is, are we keeping up? If machines are going to be faster and smarter than us,
that was going to be my next.
Yes, exactly. We're leading into that. But not preparing them for a future world is way more urgent now than it was just thinking about how schools prepare kids to be factory workers.
Right now, they're being prepared to compete with AI. It's completely, and there's no question that at some point we really cannot compete with that. And that's when it comes to the retention of data and the thought processes that will be replaced. And I feel like there is just, if we carry on pushing the kids to be able to take tests really well, then there's just no hope. I mean, it's really that basic where you're just like, well, we are humans. We're humans. These are human, young humans. And the only way to compete with AI is to focus on the things that AI will not ever be able to do. So we have to differentiate ourselves from that. And so the school system as it is not serving that at all.
I agree completely. I've had a really unique opportunity this spring to be working on a project. So the chancellor of the Dwight schools is in his 80s. He's a very visionary educator, and he does a lot of art, and he also works on his own writing. And he has a project with a Polish psychologist named Raphael who wrote a book in Polish called Emo Sapiens, which means, emotional human beings.
That's a great title.
It's not out in English yet, but they've been working on some excerpted inspiration work from the text. And I've gotten to spend some time with Raphael and kind of project manage some of what they're doing. And the whole point of this Emo Sapiens concept is that we have moved out of what has been dismissed for the last 500 years. Emotions have not been celebrated. right? Emotions have been dismissed through the idea of I think, therefore I am, right? Cognito ergo sum, not I feel, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that moving into an AI world, we've got to shift to valuing I feel, therefore I am, and moving away from I think. I actually am not fearful at all of AI, in the sense that it's here and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
harness it. And a lot of the future for our kids is going to be learning how to use it well.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding it, and maybe not coding it, but certainly utilizing it. And that is
Yes.
that's our now. But at the same time, then leveraging what makes us uniquely human and
Mm-hmm.
really understanding our brains, our senses, our emotions, and what is required. You know, Raphael and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about, so I made it through the pandemic in China. We were stuck in the country for 3 years, but I spent a lot of time still face-to-face working. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever we were able to be in school, we were in.
Yeah.
We didn't have a hybrid model. We had either fully remote or fully in person. And the beauty of being together, which was really underscored for me during the pandemic, is that idea of, let's say we're in a Zoom meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and there's 3 of us in the meeting, right? Then there's 3 of us in the Zoom meeting. But if we're physically together in a meeting, there's the 3 of us together, and then there's the 4th person that is created by all of the intangibles that aggregate when we're physically together. And a lot of the arguments for remote work, I respect, but I do startups and I run schools, and I know that being together benefits kids. And we've all seen it. And I believe in it really wholeheartedly. And I also believe in that dynamic that is created by togetherness. And so I'm actually more resistant to the remote work piece, because I don't feel like it's the best way to keep up with AI. And I know that that's not popular point of view per se, but just again, from my both startup and school operational experience, I just feel like being together is really important. And it's for that intangible connectivity that happens when you're in the room with somebody, ideating, brainstorming, dealing with difficult conversations, trying to support somebody feel how they feel, right?
I totally agree, because there is that, and you said it beautifully, there is another person in the room that is distinctly human. You know, it's energy. It's energy that's and this is stress energy, this is calm energy. It can be any form. So it's not that, you know, kids need to be in a group of kids and only that's the only way for them to be happy and prolific. No, it also means the bad side of it, to just have to share physical space with someone. Maybe if you have an argument with someone, if you disagree, or there's someone you really don't like, or who's been bullying you or whatever, but being physically present and dealing with that is such a different experience to doing it all online. And I think that's where kids especially miss out on the learning all these interpersonal situations and dealing with them and putting themselves in uncomfortable positions. It's so much easier to be comfortable behind a screen. And again, this is feeling. There's the sense of, you know, when you are in a room with someone and you're like, oh, I really don't like this person. I don't know why, but there was this feeling. Or you really click with someone and you don't really know why. And that's the beauty of the physical presence. And that's, I think, something that you can, it only happens in a physical sense. It's just not the same. And it can be more draining. And whether I'm an introvert, so I love people and I love going out and being, you know, meeting people physically. I feel it drains me too. So I need it for my own experience and to feel more human. I need the full spectrum. And that's where I just, I mean, the whole COVID notwithstanding, but it's, there's such a gap that opened up during those years. And the way the school system, coming back to schools, has dealt with that. And in terms of just now, it's like everyone's expected to just slot back into what it was like before doesn't make any sense to me.
The global results are coming out for the International Baccalaureate now, basically the 6th of July. Students learn their results globally, and A-level exam results, IGCSE come out in later in the summer. And I was discussing with someone this morning about not even the actual results, but just that results are coming out. And these are the students globally who for 3 years, right? They sat exams this year.
Yeah.
But when you think about their 3 years, and sure, pandemic, but everything, you know, if we don't hold space for that, right? If we just expect to look at those results through the same lens that we always have, they're so discrediting our young people and the teachers and what everybody's been through. But what's really interesting, right? Thinking about that sense, that sixth sense, that feeling of, okay, this person, it feels strange, or this person feels great. The thing about trauma is that you can be in a classroom with young people who are undergoing extreme trauma in all sorts of different ways: domestic violence, food scarcity, sleep deprivation. I mean, we could talk about the full spectrum, but the reality is that even if you're not discussing it, and even if the students are quote unquote well-behaved, right, their trauma manifestation isn't like poor classroom behavior, bad classroom behavior, you still have the neurological impact of the trauma on young people. And as teachers, you can train teachers, you can train doctors, I'm sure you can train prison staff, etc., people dealing with extreme trauma daily, to block some of that from the perspective of how they feel that they are open. But you can't train away the neurological impact of, like, you know, there's mirror neurons, right? There is somebody who is projecting through, you know, the neurons that our pupils facilitate us connecting with as humans. This is the challenge of Zoom. And by the way, Zoom will probably be way more advanced in the next decade. And we may have the experience of connecting pupil to pupil as opposed to just seeing each other's faces. That will change the dynamic. AI will also continue to keep up with replicating that physical experience, but we're not there yet. And so recognizing that you may not be able to train someone simply verbally or receptively to deal with trauma, you've got to give people other tools. And one of the things that I've been trying to think about with students is, and even with teachers, you know, if you're going to go into a really, really challenging conversation with a parent, with a kid, with another teacher, go run the stairs for 3 minutes, like you're not going to make the meeting easier, but you may make your own physiological response to the meeting easier, right? Before we got on to record today, actually, I wanted a coffee, so I walked to buy one. But the benefit was probably, oh, I probably should have taken a quick 10-minute fast walk before getting on with you anyway, right? Neurologically, that's probably a good thing to do, but we don't necessarily hold those things consciously for ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with sleep. I mean, honestly, if I could give any guidance to any young person, it's sleep. The sleep is the key to so much of their neurological success, not even about grades, but just about being able to function.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like that's, for example, just taking the sleep thing. All the teachers say that to the kids, like, go to bed early and do it. But they say that. I feel like there needs to be space to be taught techniques, anything, because we all these kids they want to go to sleep, they cannot, because their brains are completely overloaded with their got to get this grade, I've got to get to the next, tomorrow I've got this. They don't have any room for any downtime in their brains anyway. So I feel like there's just not enough. It's not enough just telling them. It's that they need to be trained. There needs to be space for that in school time, because they would be so much better at just absorbing information as well. But that whole physical side of it, and sleep is, the fundamental thing. But if there was more time for any sort of mental health exercises during school time, it has to be, you know, we all know you can tell a 15-year-old to do something, and then they'll be like, if it's not, you know, they're not going to do it out of their own, like, of course I'm going to, my teacher said I need to sleep, so I'm going to bed at 8, and it's not going to happen. But I feel like if it becomes an integral part of being educated, then that would be a huge thing. And I know there is a trend, and it's been noted, and teachers are doing a lot more now than they used to do when I went to school, for example, but it's still not enough.
And I think what's really interesting is that we can make it easier for ourselves, right? What's so hard is, so if we look to Asia, when I showed up in Asia, traditionally, whether it was in the office or at school, everyone took a nap, right? Nap time was a thing. And I've still had students to this day who slept during lunch, put their head down on their desk, boom, to sleep. Now, it's admirable and amazing. Part of the challenge of the nap in the middle of the day in Asia can be that it stretches the school day till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So then you have these other challenges. But rather than overcomplicate things for ourselves, like, okay, we can't stop the school day for 2 hours, but can we stop it for 26 minutes? Because the reality is, and this is why I've just, again, been so excited to be connected to this more sort of neurological and psychology driven thinking, because 26 minutes, and I said, so Raphael was telling me, listen, 26-minute break. You need 20, like if it's a 30-minute break, you need 26 minutes. And I said, well, goodness, I mean, what if you can't fall asleep? Help me get practical, right? Because I don't think I can fall asleep in the middle of the day for 26 minutes. But what is it? There's an element of it too, which is about social disconnection. So meaning, even if you are not actually asleep, which is ideal, what you need to do is you need to dump the cognitive load that's built up since the morning. Now I get up at 4:30 because I get on the phone with Vietnam from New York. So by 10:30 a.m., I've already sort of hit my early morning cognitive max, right? And for our students, for high schoolers, right, it's later in the day. Ideally, they can sleep in. Schedules also don't help us with that. But the point is, you can feel empowered to say, I am going to stop social interaction. I am going to stop digital interaction. I'm going to stop adding to my cognitive load, even if it just means I'm quiet. And that is going to help make me prime my brain for whatever I need to learn in the afternoon. And to me, again, that just feels much less overwhelming than this idea that, like, okay, we got to like take a nap, turn out the lights, because it's very hard as a teacher even to feel like you can manage that, but we can manage 26 minutes of silence.
Yeah. And just this enforced downtime in a way where it's like everyone's doing that. There's no question. It's not like you have to be like, excuse me, I need to go and do that now. But no, it's everyone is doing it. And I think that's the secret, is to just make it and offer up these tools. And I just totally believe, well, I also agree. I couldn't, if someone said to me, well, okay, you take half an hour now and you go to sleep. I'm like, yeah, are you joking? I mean, how am I going to do that? But I do believe in consistency and training. And so I think it's like, you can learn to do anything if you're prepared to put the time in and to open yourself up to it. And I think, and maybe, why not spend more time doing that and then less time on other things? Just broadly speaking, other things that are very data driven or information driven, that are, I don't think kids need to know all these facts now, whether it's history or anything, because that's something you Google, you can have that at the tip of your fingers. And that's why you don't have to be able to do it all, but prioritize mental health. Absolutely.
I also think the arc of this conversation, in a way, what's interesting is, right, we've gotten away, I think, quite successfully from how this just directly relates to that transcontinental experience. But the way it relates and what it is because in a world in which we as humans do not need to command all the facts and all the information, we need skills. And the reality is that an ability to move between cultures, an ability to embrace the discomfort of doing that, is a skill. And it's a skill that is incredibly important for the adaptability and the flexibility that we will need to have front and center for our future. And so meaning, from every single parenting decision we make, look, not everybody has the privilege of leaving the town that they grew up in. It's okay. You can do things. You can try different foods. You can play different card games. You can, take a walk, or there's so many things that you can do that help get at that same like brain adaptability, that then when you are in the future faced with an opportunity of, taking a trip or taking a job that's going to bring more differentiation into your own life, you will have actually prepared yourself, right? Because you can create, like, just one quick story. Like my son was born in China. My husband's American. We're both Caucasian, but we met in China, and my son was born there. I have 3 kids, and my youngest is 9. And he has been in the US this year, right? Really for the first time, except for holidays. And he like wants to eat bacon, steak, and hamburgers. Like he's loving it. Okay. The American beef and pork. And that has created a lot of stress for me, thinking, oh my gosh, my child who grew up in Asia and ate every single different thing there was now only wants to eat these 3 things. I sort of made a deal with him. I said, listen, I don't want to like nag you at every meal. This is, a pain, uncomfortable. It just makes eating unhappy, and that's no fun. I said, once a week, not for mom, but for your brain, to remind your brain that you can taste sashimi. I actually don't care if you like it or not. And I'm cool with that. If you don't like it, you don't like it. All right, we'll keep it open. But I'm going to ask you once a week to try something, at least a bite of something that you desperately don't want to eat. Because it's got to be buried in there. And it's the same thing for language. My son spoke fluent Mandarin for a lot of his life. He has lost huge amounts of his Chinese, and it really stresses him out. And I'm like, listen, it's there. It's in there somewhere. You just got to like keep triggering it, right? And keep bringing it forward. And I think if we can build in that type of experience, like I think kids and students need stability. They need regularity. They need schedules, but they also need micro adaptability sort of tips and tricks and things that help them keep up, right? I'm not saying radically change each day of their lives. That creates other problems, but you can do little things that help your child be prepared for a world that will demand they have greater adaptability.
Absolutely. And that self-awareness, kind of try and foster that because that's something I've found in this whole experience of moving countries and just being thrown into a different culture. And now my experience hasn't been as drastic because, I mean, the US and the UK and Germany, while very different on the whole, probably not as much as the US and China, for example. However, I found that for me, it's just made me, I feel, get to know myself so much more and so much more quickly, because I was automatically put in situations where I didn't know how something worked. I had to ask. I had to make myself very vulnerable, because it's like I'm a stranger here. I don't know how this works. Or sometimes assuming something was going to work, because I'm not someone who likes to ask how things are done. So I'm trying to cobble it together, and then falling flat on my face and thinking, oh, I should have asked. But that whole experience has made me get to know myself. And that's where I feel like this experience has helped me and my kids. Same thing, coming, seeing all these different things, and then just realizing there are so many different ways of doing things. It's just a whole different mindset. And as you said, not everyone can have the opportunity to do that. Some people are forced to do that and leave their countries, and some people, but it's trying to foster things like self-awareness, vulnerability, empathy. That's it. All these things are heightened, and I feel like that's something that we need to definitely spend more time on with our kids.
Absolutely.
So how has that been for you? Like coming onto a more personal level now, in terms of growing up, having your family in China, and you said you have 3 kids. How has that been, observing them in the different environments, and how much has that, having your own family in an international environment, how much has that shaped your own perception of things?
I think, it's made us very close, kind of a close little unit. And certainly folks are probably familiar with the third culture kid idea. And that's definitely the culture of our household. I would say we have a very strong like home culture. We make a lot of effort to celebrate American or, Western events and holidays and certainly keep that alive and eat a lot of Western food that we, make at home. And we don't, so we make a lot of space for that. Right. And we speak English at home for the most part. But at the same time, we just have an expectation that there's going to be openness and, like you said, empathy and embrace the different cultures around us and the challenges that come with that culture. I would say that my older daughter, who's almost 15, who was born in New York, just on a technicality, but grew up in China, she has strained a lot more against the sort of Asian shame women challenges. I would say I look at that now, and I've seen her be so comfortable in New York this year, and it's really been amazing to watch. And I feel like she struggled and strained against expectation. She doesn't have perfect grades. She's into sports. The US works really well for her. And I've also watched my middle child, who is much more introverted and very academic and very focused on one-on-one things. So she likes to play badminton. She likes to play ping pong. She really calculates her GPA like constantly. She's in 7th grade. She is disconcerting to some people because they don't really get that, well, this kid has never lived in the West before, but she looks, completely Caucasian. And my kids are completely Caucasian. I mean, there is no immigration. There's no like passport or documentation that would allow them to be Chinese. They would make no claim to that. And they, that's just not even a conversation in our household. They are, Western American kids who happen to grow up outside of the US. And my son, I think, just again, he's a very balanced person. He can think about things quite well from both sides for a 9-year-old, just having been exposed to lots and lots of different points of view. So I think that I'm a little bit like tough on my kids. I think sometimes, forcing the expectation that they flow in these different circumstances. But I actually think I'd be that way no matter where we lived. I want them to be open and bold and brave and courageous and to take on different experiences. The reality is maybe one of them would be interested in living in Asia. Maybe they will never have any interest whatsoever. I'm cool with that. Right. I think we've got to give them space.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it, to watch what goes on, because this is an experience we shared, just kind of having children who are brought up in a different cultural environment. So, and we have the same, we have our British and German traditions and things like that. But the influence from the outside is on them is much stronger than it is on myself, for example. So it's just really interesting to observe that. And like you said, giving them the space to explore. And in some ways they have it a lot easier because they have been exposed to so much. So they have seen themselves in different situations. They know they go and spend the summer with the grandparents, and they know that there's different food. And at the same time, it also makes it harder because they don't have maybe the same sense of what are my roots, my identity. They I guess question things maybe much more than other kids their age.
What's amazing about kids and kids who've had different migration experiences is how easy it can be. I mean, and how much they can adapt to comfort and fluidity in different situations. And I think that's just really wonderful to watch. I've taken my kids all over the US this year just to travel, visiting family in Alabama, going to New Orleans, Las Vegas. I mean, and they just flow with all of those different experiences, and they really embrace them and just maybe have less bias than I have towards those experiences.
Yes.
And so I would think, at the end of the day, right, helping our kids be adaptable and flexible, but also just helping them helping them deal with bias, whether conscious or unconscious, and modeling for them, and just stepping back and, not overly priming them for, well, we're going into this experience and you're going to see your cousins in rural Alabama and it's going to be like this. I just learned to be quiet.
Yeah. Yes. And then also, because you have 3, I have 2, just seeing how differently they react to things as well in situations. So, but that's why I feel like sometimes it's different. I'm not, I don't have expectations that maybe other American parents who live in my community here have, because we're coming from completely different backgrounds and our horizons are very different. And it's just, so a lot of flexible thinking, I think, all around, and I love that. So it's certainly been I've loved the whole process. And again, the teenage years are tough wherever you are, whatever background you have. And we are now in a fortunate position. Now my youngest is finishing high school at a very innovative school. So we're very fortunate to be able to send her to this school. She's really struggled at the public high school, really, really struggled. And so that's where I'm like, I can see how they are trying to disrupt the system by offering a different way of doing things. And then it's like, well, this is, again, such a privilege for a certain very small part of the population, because it's just not accessible to the rest. And so I'm hoping that, I don't know, our kids might be among those who really create change.
I think 3 things happened to my kids that probably, I know that they have a lot to gripe about with me, but I think 3 things that probably served them well. One was that I didn't stay in New York and take on all the pressures that I feel in that context, which is my home context. So moving abroad probably helped them. The second would be choosing to work in education, because I can see so much of the challenge that parents bring to their kids in different ways. And I think that it helped me to be in that every day. I can better relate to what it feels like to be a teenager, because I see it and feel it on a daily basis. And so, again, doesn't mean I don't have conflict with particularly my teenager, but right. But at least I'm in there, because I could have been a total nightmare, I think, if I had just imposed on them the same expectations and the same framework that I came up in. And I think, certainly, look, access to different types of education. I would, if it's a path that they're interested in, I would heavily encourage my kids to go into education. And I think that that's not something that is the reality for most. Oh, your teacher, ooh, but the reality is,
well, because the system is so broken that the teachers in this country have to work a second job to make ends meet. And how just fundamentally wrong is that? And that's why everyone's like, oh, you don't earn enough to live if you're a teacher. And that's such a crazy concept, and that I think is also different in other countries. But anyway, that's me complaining about the US school system again. But absolutely. And to that, the things that have helped, I would add the fact, well, I feel that's certainly true for myself, and I'm sure for yourself too. If you live in a new environment, different environment, even if you speak the language somewhat, your kids will witness you being a stranger. They will witness you being vulnerable and fallible. They will see you make mistakes. They will see you ask for help. They will see all that. So they will see your human side, which I feel sometimes parents are very much like they know everything, and they never admit weakness, and they want to show up as a strong example for their children. And if your children see that you're not perfect, that also I think helps in their whole growing up. That's generational, of course, as well. And so I think that's definitely something that comes into this whole expat experience.
Absolutely. This year in New York, or last year, I had to resit the driving test for my driver's license, because the last time I drove a car in the US was 2008. So my license expired and I failed the first drive. I passed the written test, but I failed the first driving exam. And it's a big joke. It's like my kids are like, don't let mom drive. And actually, it's always my mom that does the driving, their grandmother. So it's certainly not gendered. But and it's been really interesting. And I just said, like, listen, guys, I mean, I failed that test. I've got to do it again. I'm nervous. I want to do my best. And so on holiday, my husband and I rented a car just so I could like drive around. And we were telling the kids, hey, and those are the kind of things, exactly, like humbling sort of things that if you keep embracing your own vulnerability and putting yourself out there. And that's a simple example, but I think we can do it all the time. I used to say to my team, like, don't coddle me. Like, I don't like to be coddled. I want to be very independent. And what happened in Vietnam was my team was like, okay, that means she doesn't want any help with anything. And I was like, oh, no. Actually, I need a lot of help. You don't need to come at me as from a position of weakness. But the reality is I can barely do anything for myself in Vietnam, whereas in China, I could do a lot. So maybe I actually do need to be coddled a little bit. It's been this very interesting experience of being helpless.
Yes. But it's so essential. It's so essential to our humanity and to us kind of, being a bit humble from time to time and going, okay. And then not being afraid to show that.
When I was first in China, kind of final story, I would go to Carrefour, the big supermarket. It's a French chain.
Yeah.
And first of all, I was working in advertising. I worked a lot and I would barely leave my apartment on the weekends because I was so freaked out about being like noticed. And people in the old days in China used to say like, look, a foreigner's coming, lawai, lawai, lawai. And like, I was just like, I don't want anyone to notice me. I don't want anybody to see me. But I would go to Carrefour and I can remember experiences where like a granny would be like taking the butter out of my cart and like looking at it and being like, what is she buying? And I would be like, like, don't take food out of my cart. Oh my God, I'm so freaked out. And I was so freaked out. And like now I would just like sashay through a Carrefour, like da. Nobody even cares if I'm there. It's Shanghai. So what? You're a foreigner, and all of that experience and just the physical experience of forcing myself to leave my apartment and not completely freaking out if somebody would like touch the butter in my shopping cart. And now I look back on those and I think it's hilarious.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. It's like I started writing a blog when we first moved to the US, and now when I reread what I wrote, sometimes I just shake my head at myself and I'm like, oh my God, my head was in a completely different space. So I can see that the change that's happened within me. And so and then it's really nice to be able to share that with whether it's your children or your students. So anyway, I'm so happy to have had this conversation with you, because it's just we just need people in this field, and that dealing with people of that age group to just create change and just open minds. So thank you very much for taking the time. And I would love to finish our conversation with a personal question, the one I always ask people at the end. And that's, what do you do when you feel really homesick? I guess I would say when you're in China, missing the US, or when you're in the US, what do you do? Is there anything, a recipe, tradition, anything that you and your family do?
So certainly food is big. And I would say in China, it's, seeking out a great Western meal. And in New York, definitely seeking out, great dumplings or things that we really enjoy as a family. But I would say my coping mechanism for really when I feel emotionally anyway, right, missing home is walk. So I love to walk. Walking for me, cures all ills. If I feel like I'm stuck, I can't be creative, take a walk. If I feel frustrated or, somehow not able to cope with what's going on, I take a walk. So I would say that that's my strategy for managing it. But I would say that I'm not a great cook. My husband cooks really well, but definitely just a restaurant experience of a different cuisine is certainly something that brings a lot of comfort. And just doing things as a family, like creating an event that my kids are going to really enjoy, or doing something that that we're all going to find fun in and create memories and make memories, I think is how I help. But I'm lucky that I don't I don't have a lot of homesickness. Where it actually hits me is as soon as I land. When I land in the US, I get overwhelmed by that feeling of like, oh my gosh, I'm back in America. If I land in Asia, I feel like, okay, I'm here. And it generally hits me at that moment how much I might have missed certain aspects of the culture, and then, bounce out and come back in. So the pandemic was hard because not being able to move at all and connect with the West was it was tiresome, and it was what ultimately contributed to my departure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love the walking. I do the same. Yeah, it just unblocks certain things. And so before I start babbling and going on, I think we should wrap it up. Anything else you wanted to mention, or where you feel like we need to go back into?
No, just, it was such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. And I enjoy listening to the show. And it's such an interesting kind of tapestry of all these different experiences people have. No two are alike. And would encourage folks to get in touch if they're curious or certainly interested in teaching. Always happy to give advice about how to go abroad and teach. And stay in touch. And I know you had asked me what the best way to stay in contact was. And because I was behind that firewall in China for so long, I have less social media presence, but I think LinkedIn. So Brantley Turner on LinkedIn is probably the best way to be in contact. Okay. And I'm always happy to communicate.
I'll share all that in the show notes so people get in touch. And I would certainly like to stay in touch because I'm fascinated by all things education, and if in any way I can be part of the revolution in education, I'm in.
No, well, wonderful. I'll definitely stay in contact and keep you posted on how all this new move goes. Maybe I'll change some of my thesis as I face those challenges.
Yeah, so we absolutely ran out of time to talk about that, but yes, good luck with it all in Hanoi, and a new start for your family and kids. I mean, I know you have visited, but have they?
Last summer we went to Hanoi. Okay. We had a signing ceremony for the school, my husband and I, but I said, we've got to take the kids, because if we spend the next year kind of trying to manage what their expectations are, this is going to be really, really, really challenging. So last year's summer holiday for the family, they came along with us to a meeting in Hanoi.
Yes. Oh, wow. Anyway, good luck, and let's stay in touch.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you again, Brantley, for this wonderful conversation. I just want to add at this point that we recorded this almost 3 months ago. I just haven't had the headspace to do anything with it. But actually, I love that I had that break because when I sat down to edit it, our conversation felt even more fresh and exciting when I listened to it again. And I really noticed how positive it is. As I said in my introduction, I feel like I've talked a lot about how hard it is for children to live in many cultures and move a lot during their formative years. And our conversation was so much about how beneficial this can be, and how children who have experienced all those changes have a bit of a head start compared to their peers because of the ability to look at things more objectively from an outsider's point of view, because of their vulnerability they've experienced and their self-awareness, their mental agility, lack of judgment, all those things. And so it becomes even more apparent how important it is to teach all young people these skills. And I so wish it could be something available to everybody and not just that tiny portion of people who can afford to go to a private school with that sort of approach. Anyway, I am very hopeful that the importance of our emotions is something that will become more and more obvious, and I know that our kids and the future generations will make sure that that's the case. I just wish it could happen more quickly. And with that, I will stop talking. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Take care and see you next time.